Welcome back to this online brown bag series on Follies in fragile states. My name is Ian Quick and this is part 2 of 6. I want to kick off with a trip to a town called Kinyandoni in eastern Congo, just across the border with Uganda. My colleague took this photo in mid-2009. The team was chased out of town shortly after taking it, as you can probably guess. What had happened was that we had supported the deployment of the territorial police to Kinyandoni. And they had done exactly what everybody insisted that they do. They had arrested a member of an armed group. Specifically, a member of the FDLR, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda. The next day, the FDLR had counterattacked. They killed one of these officers, they wounded several more, they torched the equipment, and of course they liberated their colleague. Now this is horrible, but it's not unusual. Incidents like this happen most days in eastern Congo. What I really want to stress instead are the conversations we had afterwards with local civil officials. They admitted quite candidly they were not unhappy about this. They criticized the officers you're looking at as idle, not speaking local languages, not understanding how local customary chiefs worked. In short, it was pretty clear that the FDLR had been tipped off. This was shocking. The FDLR is the most notorious of all armed groups in eastern DRC. It is descended from genocidaires who fled Rwanda in 1994, and it generally is thought to have no political agenda in Congo itself. So this sort of collaboration between community and an armed group that had very little in common was a real learning moment, or it should have been a real learning moment. When we did these law and order interventions to arrest so-called warlords, to catch the bad guys, the fact is, the police, the army, the judiciary were resisted and they were sometimes attacked. To the extent that we in the UN and international organizations were collaborators, we met the same resistance. This points us squarely to the first major folly of international intervention in the Congo. I call this the Makeover Fantasy because there was a vision for what a stable Congo looked like, but it was fundamentally mismatched with some rather fixed realities on the ground. These can be summarized fairly as the weight of history. The DRC groans under the pressure of well over a century of misgovernance. King Leopold's privately owned Congo Free State, the Belgian colony that was dismantled in remarkably reckless fashion, 30 years of Mobutu, the archetypal Cold War dictator, 2 major wars. As a consequence of all this, the country, when I got there, was dead last on the Human Development Index. It is near the bottom on virtually all indicators of quality of governance or of economic health. So when we entered that environment, the question we had to ask ourselves was, what's feasible? What does stabilization look like? Well, the answer that was actually given is well illustrated here. This is a presentation to the Security Council in 2010 by a UN planner. It has the virtue of clarity. On the x-axis, we have efficiency of the state. On the y-axis, we have peace. So the gist of the longer presentation was simply to assert a causal relationship. If better governance, stronger governance, then less conflict. The origins of this idea date to 2006. The Second Congo War, from the late 90s to the early 2000s, had actually split the country up. It had pulled in half a dozen neighboring states. That was the bottom of the curve. The Congo had slowly climbed up with painstaking negotiation of national institutions, but violence still continued in the eastern part of the country. So the new central government and its international partners pivoted to focus there. That's what we referred to as stabilization. The working theory, the treatment for the rest of East, was thus to build out along this x-axis. One of the government's first major policy initiatives was called a good governance contract. Bilateral donors in a country assistance framework defined their central challenge as building an effective state in a country where there has never been one. Lobbyists like Human Rights Watch and the Enough Project insisted that violence would be addressed through comprehensive demobilization of all armed groups, apprehension and prosecution of warlords, control of how conflict minerals, quote unquote, were extracted all over the country. So this was effectively a law and order or regulatory model. In my part of the House, the UN, the Security Council said much the same thing. It defined the exit strategy for UN peacekeepers And at this point, there were well over 20,000, with reference to the functions we wanted the government to take over. And these were defined so generically that they were usually referred to by their acronyms. Security sector reform, SSR, restoration of state authority, RESA, disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, DDR. We find these same formulas still up to the present day in 2016, and if you look through the cases I mentioned in the introduction, we find the same formulas there. Mali, South Sudan, Central African Republic. When we map this more or less logic onto physical space, we get something like the following. This comes from a 2010 situation assessment for the provinces of North and South Kivu and the district of Ituri. It's not a master plan. There's no single document that captures what everybody is doing in Eastern Congo, but it was consulted very widely, and it does reflect a very widespread model. And the logic could not be simpler. Deeper blue equals more state, stronger government. And to prepare it, we traveled around with a picture of what an effective government looked like, those lists of functions I just mentioned. And we compared it with the terrain, territory by territory, province by province. We inventoried how many police, whether courts existed, and so forth. At the operational level, the ambition was then to move up the scale. The exit strategy for peacekeepers was essentially to shade key areas in deeper and deeper blue. And that approach, that makeover, that reshaping had two main elements. The first is abundantly clear here. This is a slide from a presentation to a high-level government steering group. It was also used extensively in New York and with bilateral aid agencies. The picture is of Masisi town. This is one of the real hotspots over the last 30 years. Stunning scenery, it must be said, but severe frictions over land and local political authority. What jumps out immediately is the fetishization of stuff. New buildings, bright blue roofs in close to UN blue, seeming to tower over old Masisi. Price tags proudly marked for a new police station, a new prison, a new tribunal. So in effect, we're looking at a surge of investment. Physical capital, buildings, equipment. Human capital, training, deployment. Something like $1 billion in programs. No one can give the exact figure, but if we total up things like the European Union's restoration of justice in the Congo, the UN-backed security and stabilisation support strategy, aid agency support to service delivery, we certainly come out well over $1 billion. The second limb of our efforts, alongside all this, was the symbolic. There were dozens of inaugurations and official ceremonies that went along with the major milestones in the physical investment program. These were elaborately choreographed and quite remarkably boring events, and all of them had two fixed features. The first is the presence of central government officials. These are the guys with the big hats and the political paraphernalia. Up to and including at bottom right, pulling the portrait of President Kabila off the wall and bringing it to the event. The second fixed feature is the presence of international officials. We heavily deployed the supposed moral legitimacy of the UN and of the international diplomatic community. The grumpy fellow at the bottom left is the senior UN official in country. We also see Romanian, Pakistani, Dutch, Nigerian officials. So that's the two-part formula. Physical, symbolic strengthening of the central government. We saw how it played out in Kinyandoni. We saw it in a lot of other places, in Masisi, just to the west, in Bunyakiri, in South Kivu. Finally in Goma, in that quite awful scene I started with in the introduction. In part 3, I'll walk through how that happened. Why it was a fantasy that we could so quickly reshape things in the way that we intended. And until next time, thanks for listening.